It was a tough week for a couple of billionaires. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Jesse Balmert, State House reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer, Julie Carr-Smythe, State House correspondent for the Associated Press, Joseph Maas of the Ohio Hispanic Coalition, and Michael Miller, former Franklin County prosecutor. Primary election month is here. Ohio voters began casting ballots this week ahead of the March 17th primary. Republicans certainly will choose Donald Trump as their nominee for president. The Democratic Party's choice is far from certain. This week's debate did not make the choice any easier for the undecided. The contentious, downright nasty session had candidates blasting each other. The one who took the most hits, former New York mayor and billionaire Michael Bloomberg.
I'm a New Yorker. I know how to take on an arrogant con man like Donald Trump that comes from New York. I'm a mayor, or was a mayor. I know how to run a complicated city, the biggest, most diverse city in this country.
I'd like to talk about who we're running against. A billionaire who calls women fat broads and horse-faced lesbians. And no, I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Mayor Bloomberg.
Joe Maas, it went downhill from there, if you can believe it. Can he recover? Can Bloomberg recover from that performance?
Of course he can. And, you know, at the end of the day, you've got two types of Democratic voters in Ohio as well as in the nation. The one who is interested in the candidates with the big messages, which would be Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and so on, and then the ones who just care about beating Trump. And that particular crowd seems to think that either a Biden or Bloomberg is going to be. Everybody else is just sort of on the fringes.
Or would Ohioans be warming to a Bernie Sanders? It seemed like they would be more inclined for the moderate, but Bernie Sanders is climbing in the polls nationally, Julie.
Yes, he really is, but I think that, you know, in this state, our Democrats are as divided as anyone and could really split this vote because they have a lot of choices on the ballot, and, you know, including Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, and most of our Democrats who remain Democrats are sort of leaning left, but still middle.
Joe Biden, Jesse, had a decent night. No major gaffes. He seemed like he had more energy, was more engaged in this debate, based on the reviews and what I saw.
Yeah, I think the real test for Joe Biden going forward are these next two races, Nevada and South Carolina. He's really said that he is the electable one, the one that can get there against Donald Trump, and he really is depending on the votes of especially minority voters, of Black and brown voters, and so those are two states where there's going to be a higher percentage of that than in New Hampshire and Iowa. And so if he can do well there, if he can win there or come close, that keeps his campaign alive. If he does rather poorly, I think he's in a bit of trouble.
Mike, Democrats just going at each other the whole time. It was Elizabeth Warren on Amy Klobuchar, everyone against Michael Bloomberg, people against Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg. Donald Trump was sort of like beside the point during that debate. That has to work in Republicans' favor.
Well, I don't know, Mike. I sort of agree with what Joe said. I just think if you get somebody from the left, Sanders, perhaps Warren, I think there'll be a lot of Democrats that just won't vote for him or her in the presidential thing. I don't think they'd move over to Trump, but I think it's like last year, you know, I think or 4 years ago, there were numerous Republicans, I think, that were the same way, could not vote for Trump. And they either stayed home, I suppose some of them voted for Hillary Clinton and some of them voted for an independent candidate, but it's really going to be interesting. All these people have strong personalities. And it's kind of fun to watch what's going on.
But, you know, Donald Trump taught us all a lesson, and that is that it doesn't matter in the national polls that much. What it matters is in the swing states. And you look at those, and those are divided. Wisconsin apparently is going to go for Trump.
He's up in the polls right now, yeah.
In Wisconsin, quite a bit. But in Pennsylvania, even in Florida, and certainly in Ohio, and so on, head-to-head with Biden, head-to-head with Bloomberg, looks good. Heck, for that matter, a head-to-head with Bernie Sanders looked okay. But I'm concerned, like Mike said, about people staying home.
We have to remember that in the primary, the Republicans did have that choice and went for John Kasich in Ohio last time. And so it could be a similar thing where they pick someone who then, doesn't make it out.
Will establishment Democrats ever get behind Bernie Sanders?
I think it's going to be hard. I think, to your point, I think they might stay home. But there is a pervasive feeling among Democrats that the most important thing is beating Donald Trump this election. And I think that feeling is stronger than perhaps it even was in 2016, when it was more the possibility of Donald Trump versus he is actually running for re-election this time. So I think that is just what Democrats are keeping in the back of their mind. The challenge is, I think they're not sure who is the most electable candidate right now.
Well, and they don't want to look as if they somehow manipulate Sanders out of the lead, because they did that last time and took a really hard hit.
Well, that leads to my next question, Joe. Will Bernie Sanders support the nominee if it's not Bernie Sanders? Will his supporters support them?
Well, that's two questions. And
I guess his supporters are
it's
most
really
important.
two questions, because I do think that Bernie Sanders would support the nominee. But from what I have seen from some of his supporters, many of them Facebook friends of mine and so on, I don't think they are. When I say they, I'm talking about a percentage of them. It'll be similar to what happened last time.
A socialist candidate running in an era, Mike, where the unemployment rate's at a record low, stock market's at record highs, wages are on the rise. If times are really tough, you could say blow the system up. It's going to be a hard sell. I'm thinking about suburban moderates, even moderate Republicans, independents, if Sanders is the nominee or if Warren is the nominee.
Well, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. But on the other hand, there's so many people, I think, are disenchanted with the president that they might look more of a socialist, kind of ignoring he's a socialist than before because of their dislike for Trump. I know the polls. I thought the day of the election 4 years ago that Hillary Clinton would win easily, and that she would take Ohio by about 5 points. Yes. So that shows you what I know. People are volatile out there.
Yeah. Well, and there's this huge surge of support for Sanders among young people, college age. And, he's playing to that. I don't know if you've seen some of these ads where it's, Bob Dylan songs and trying to position him as the head of a movement of a new time and a new era. And, I think a lot of establishment Democrats are going to say, well, if he's the nominee, I'm certainly not going to vote for Trump. And
he also has more space to run. It's really on the left side of the bracket, it's him and Elizabeth Warren, whereas there's a whole slew of moderate candidates still in the race right now who are not really consolidating or uniting under one person.
All right, next topic. It's the end of an era for Central Ohio's billionaire. After nearly 60 years building and leading his retail empire, Les Wexner announced this week he will step down as CEO of L Brands. Wexner's new position will be chairman emeritus. L Brands will also sell off Victoria's Secret, the brand that fueled the company's once explosive growth. The moves come after L Brands stock has lost 75% of its value over the past 5 years. For Wexner, he will no longer run the company he founded. He opened his first store in Upper Arlington in 1963. It grew into a retail empire. His specialty shops remade malls all around the country. He became definitely the most influential business leader in Central Ohio. He donated millions of dollars to local institutions, including Ohio State. But in recent months, Wexner has faced questions about the culture at Victoria's Secret and his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, who faced sex trafficking charges before he died. Julie Carr Smythe, it is the end of an era, both for retail and perhaps for Central Ohio.
Yes, I mean, as you mentioned, what Les Wexner, because of his presence here, we have New Albany. We have a highway system that leads to New Albany. We have the Wexner Medical Center. We have the Wexner Center for the Arts. We also became a place where if you were interested in something like this Victoria's Secret or any of the limited stores, they were testing products here. They would roll them out first here. They provided jobs to local, artisans and people who were helping with their merchandising and marketing. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next for L Brands.
Yeah, it's almost 8,000 people work there, so they're uneasy right now.
You can imagine. But you know, when you look at his story and the trajectory of what he did with his company, it was truly amazing. He was like the perfect guy at a perfect time in retail history. He was able to anticipate the trends that were happening at the time in the 90s and in the early 2000s almost perfectly. But the problem is that his time ran out. As a visionary, his time ran out. Now, the company, 55% of which now is going to be handled by Sycamore, it's actually in pretty good hands. Sycamore has done a good job with some of the other retail outlets, such as Talbot's and so on, that they have been managing now.
Of course, the other thing is that Victoria's Secret has hit a real #MeToo wall. And there's been so much pushback against what it's standing for, a whole bunch of uncomfortable undergarments that, sexualize women. And so, I think that he got really quickly into wanting to distance himself from that if he could.
About a year ago, during I think it was the 20th anniversary of the opening of Easton, which was another pioneering move, he's told Business First and other publications he had no intention of stepping down. Thought it was ludicrous. A year later, here he is. How much of this is because the stock price has been tanking, and how much of it is because of the stuff swirling around with Jeffrey Epstein and the New York Times article from a couple of weeks ago, do you think?
I think it's a combination of both. Certainly Victoria's Secret, as we've been talking about, has faced some drop in sales. They've also faced challengers from people like Aerie, from the Schottensteins, even here in Columbus, and just kind of the change of what the kind of shape and type of model you even want to be using in the 21st century. Victoria's Secret was kind of lagging behind those trends of body positivity and so forth. And then, of course, the connections to Epstein and allegations that Epstein had, access to individuals because of his ties to Victoria's Secret, and just the closeness of their connection was really troubling, I imagine, for investors and just people who are associated with the company.
What's his role as a civic leader in Columbus, do you think, going forward, Mike? Does he remain as prominent as he has been?
Well, I think absolutely he does. And I look at this, the demise, if you will, of Victoria's Secret. I'm really kind of surprised they bought it for like $525 million. It was one time $2 billion.
Yeah.
But I really think it's been, as these people just commented on, the Me Too movement and things of that nature. I really don't think it was Jeffrey Epstein, because Epstein really came out with Wexner heavily within the last year, something like that. And the sales from the business had dropped dramatically for 3 or 4 years. And remember that Mr. Wexner is 82 years old.
Yeah.
And there comes a point in time, I think, where you just said, enough, I'll concentrate on something less. But as a civic leader, as Julie said, all the great things he's done from his community, I can't believe he's going to drop out of sight.
And most recently, he had a huge hand in the Veterans Museum downtown, which is a landmark of architecture. I mean, he's really stood for that kind of just inventive architecture and support of art and museums and that kind of thing.
But folks are still a little uneasy. They don't know what's next. If anything's coming out next in this story, there'll be legal proceedings continue, civil cases, things like that. Might we see him keep a low profile for a year, Joe, do you think? Or
Not necessarily. No, I don't think so. I think that this isn't that kind of a story. I think this is a passing of an era. I think it's a business story. I hate to see it. I don't see it as anything more than that.
Okay.
I feel like maybe a perfect storm of, as we're all talking,
Yeah.
the Me Too era, the Epstein stuff, which was a hassle, his age, and the time had changed. I mean, retail has changed significantly in how we purchase things, and the substantial presence they had in malls. Malls are going away.
Yeah, I mean, the stock price went from a high of almost $100 a share down to as low as $15 or $16 a couple of years ago. It's bounced back up to like 25 now, but that shareholders for a public company, he was the longest serving CEO, but shareholders only have so much patience, I guess. There is new pressure to abolish Ohio's death penalty, and it's coming from a surprising group. Lifelong Republicans, a group called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty this week, called on Ohio lawmakers to end capital punishment. The group says the death penalty is too expensive to prosecute, unfairly administered, runs the risk of killing an innocent person, and goes against pro-life beliefs. Among those in the group, former Governor Bob Taft and former Attorney General Jim Petro. Mike Miller, you're a lifelong conservative. Is it time to do away with the death penalty?
Well, I don't think so, but that varies with different people. It's always been that way. It's been more of a moral issue than a legal issue, I think. And the pendulum has swung many times in my lifetime for the country in favor of it, not in favor of it. I hate to have these things tied to money, saying it's too expensive. It really troubles me if we get to a problem where justice is going to be decided by how much money you have. And if you don't have enough money, we're going to change the justice system, which I don't like. But just things have been set forth. The governor, they had him quoted in here as just commenting. He hadn't taken a position yet, but saying he thinks some things the best sentence is just, lock it up and throw the key away and keep him in. That's the safest way. Well, we had a guy here recently. He's killed 2 people in prison. He's in for one murder. He kills another one. They try. There's nothing they can do. They bring people on a van from one of the prison systems to a court date. He kills another one. I mean, it's not necessarily the safest thing, certainly if you're an inmate. And so far as the speaker saying, pretty much the same thing about that's the way to go, I just disagree. And I think, I know the president of the Senate saying, we're a long ways from it. But I just feel that when the speaker says this is the worst penalty, well, I look at it this way. We all know who Gary Gilmore is. Why do we know Gary Gilmore, or most of us anyway? Because Gary Gilmore volunteered to be executed in Utah some 30 years ago that Norman Mailer wrote a book on.
He was the first one after the Supreme Court.
That's right. Now, since then, there was a guy in Indiana. We had one here. Very few people. I believe there's 140 people on death row now in Ohio. And how many of those people have thrown away their appeal rights? What I'm saying is they don't feel like the speaker does. They feel the last thing in the world they want is a death sentence, where the speaker says, really, it's the worst penalty, being locked up. Maybe for people like the speaker, but not for these people that kill other people.
Joe, should it be done away with?
I have been against the death penalty for my entire adult life. And I don't think it's an issue of justice. I understand why Mike is saying that, because I think you can have justice without putting somebody to death. I think it is possible to punish people without reaching that ultimate conclusion. We have a good system. I think our system of justice is good. I think those who handle it, the judges and attorneys, are competent and hardworking, but mistakes can be made. And I think that if you have a ultimate sentence that takes away the ability to reverse, and I worked with a man who was on death row for 10 years. He was very young. He was, I think, 18 years old when he was accused of having committed a terrible murder. And then 10 years later, the actual murderer comes up and then makes a deal and says, this is all the murderers I've been involved in. Let that guy go. So it can happen. And for that reason, I think you can have justice without the ultimate punishment.
This is Republicans who have either longtime duly supported capital punishment or at least kept their beliefs private.
Right.
So this is kind of striking that it's coming from this side.
Yes, and it seems a little similar to me to the very quick about face on the heartbeat bill last year, when the writing appeared to be on the wall. I mean, Ohio's really good when the writing appears to be on the wall to hop right on the bandwagon, and so it's sort of as if, okay, well, we know the heartbeat bill's getting to the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll support it now after not for 10 years. Same thing here. Our death penalty is stalled. We have an effective moratorium. We can't get any drugs. It seems to be, and that's not a system that anyone wants to preside over, because it's a hassle to have to keep defending it and then having people sitting there.
Mike, I thought it was really interesting that in a couple of the articles that have been written on this relative to the governor, they have commented his pro-life stance and tied it to perhaps his reluctance to continue with this. And I think that is an appropriate, having been raised a Catholic, I think that is an accurate way of expressing that.
But Jesse, that hasn't been always the same. It's hidden among the when you think of pro-life movement, you think of anti-abortion, but many of those folks have also thought that, or believed that capital punishment was wrong. Euthanasia is wrong. But that's coming out now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons. Some people talk about the money, some people talk about the inaccessibility of drugs, some people talk about the concern about unequal justice, some people talk about their pro-life stance. So there's a lot of different ways that people are coming to similar conclusions. But I think in effect, there's not going to be, at least right now, enough lawmakers saying, let's get rid of the death penalty in Ohio, and that's what the Senate president is saying. And so I think the most likely course forward is that the governor is just going to keep delaying these things again and again.
Mike, you mentioned you're a favor of it, but you look at two recent cases here in Central Ohio. There's a guy, Quentin Smith, convicted of killing 2 police officers from Westerville. Just this week, Anthony Pardon, convicted of murdering and raping a woman. Both times the jury said no death penalty. Heinous crimes, terrible crimes, but the jury said we're not ready to put this person to death. Are the juries ahead of the lawmakers on this? In Franklin County, anyway?
Well, Franklin County's been very difficult the last 10 or 15 or even, perhaps even 20 years in obtaining a death sentence. It used to be Hamilton County was always the leader.
Cincinnati.
And now it's Cuyahoga County, which kind of surprises me, the statistics for the state of Ohio. But no, I don't say they're the head of it. Mike, it's always been difficult to obtain. It always should be difficult to obtain. I mean, you are talking about a life, but I think we can point to things like Ted Bundy. I mean, how many people would sit around and say Ted Bundy can kill 20 or 30 or 40 innocent young women, but he should not be executed? I know that's an exaggerate, I'm picking a case way out there. But to me, you have to have the death penalty because there are people like Ted Bundy. Thank God there's not a lot of them, but they're there.
Is that a source of compromise where it's for the most heinous crimes, acts of terrorism, multiple murders? I mean, right now it's basically children, cops, and
It may turn
bad
out
cases,
to be
yeah.
that, Mike, some sort of a compromise, but I don't think so. I think when the countries that have done away with the death penalty have done away with the death penalty, period.
All right. It looks like Ohio's different levels of governments could join forces in the legal fight against opioid drug companies. Top state leaders and local governments are reportedly close to a deal to divide the proceeds from a settlement with drug makers and distributors. The deal would give local communities 30% of a settlement right off the top. The state would get 15%. The rest, 55%, would be controlled by a nonprofit foundation, which would dole it out. Jesse Baumert, are local governments satisfied with 30% guarantee off the top? Is that going to help them?
Well, I think it's hard because there are a lot of local governments, so it's hard to get that many people on the same page. I think you're seeing a lot of folks saying this is good, we're getting money that is going to be accessible to us, and there is a lot of concern from local governments about the state holding on to this money because of past experiences with the tobacco settlement, but also even local government fund. There isn't a lot of trust from local governments in the state to handle their money properly right now, and so there's some hesitation among some people saying, you know, this isn't the best path forward. In particular, Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley has some concerns about how it's going to be kind of managed.
The foundation is, they'll have more than half of this money.
Right.
What's going to be their criteria for doling it out?
Well, and some of the parties feel it's pretty unclear how that would work, but it would have a 25-member board or larger and run 19 regions around the state. Some of the cities are their own regions, but that sounds like a huge bureaucracy to some of the local governments. And they're not quite sure because the non-metropolitan cities and areas would have more votes on that board than the metropolitan areas. And so it's unclear whether somehow they would not release the money to the areas that have been the hardest hit.
Joe, what's the solution?
I think that the solution, because we're talking about this because there's actually a proposal where people sat around a table in the urban areas as well as the rural areas sat down and they came up to this. And the attorneys also had to give in some because the cut typically on civil cases is about a third or 30%, and I think that this was moderated to 11%, and they were on board.
Well, it's only one case. They have
it's a
less
lot of
work.
money anyway.
It's only one case. They have a lot less work, right?
Well, it's a lot. No, no,
That's not how it works?
no, no, it's not one case.
All right, let's get to our final off-the-record parting shots. Mike Miller up first.
Well, what we talked about tonight is all very interesting, but I think the big stuff now starts with the baseball season. I'm thrilled to see it starting, and I believe that the talk about the Houston Astros and the cheating scandal is going to last all year. It's going to be a tough year for Houston.
There'll be a lot of banging on trash cans.
Yes, there will be.
Parks all around the year. Joe.
This week, Dave Yost, our Attorney General, announced that millions of photographs from our driver's licenses are going to be released to immigration authorities. And this, everybody knows that it has something to do with facial recognition. So can racial profiling be far behind?
Julie.
There was some news this week that the intelligence community has verified that the Russians are interfering again in the 2020 election. I just really urge people to be vigilant, to try to watch out for fake news and look up tools that are available to you to make sure the information you're looking at is accurate.
Jesse.
I just want to promote some work from my colleague Jackie Borchert. She investigated and sent off for testing some CBD products and found, by and large, they were what they said they were, but there were some instances where CBD was much less than what was on the packaging, and there was some instances where there's some not so great stuff in there. So just check that out.
All right. If this group that opposes the death penalty doesn't get its way with the legislature, there's a chance it could go on the ballot, maybe a slim chance, but that would be an interesting campaign to actually have Ohioans vote. Do you support the death penalty or do you not? That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online, Facebook, Twitter. You can continue the conversation there. You can get each episode on demand at our website, wosu.org. For our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.